My name is Linda Brooks, and I have carried this story inside me for years, never sure if I should tell it out loud. I am 65 now, a retired nurse, and I thought I had already lived through the hardest storms life could throw at me. I lost my husband far too young, rebuilt piece by piece, and tried to find a quiet kind of peace in Seattle. But nothing prepared me for the night of my daughter's engagement party. The moment is burned into my memory. I was holding a glass of champagne, watching Emily glow in her white dress, when I saw him. A face I thought I would never see again. A face that had nearly destroyed me 7 years ago. My hand went cold, and the glass slipped. It shattered against the marble floor, the sharp crack echoing through the room like my heart splitting all over again. People stared, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just stood there, frozen, staring at the man now smiling beside my daughter. My blood felt like ice. I knew that smile too well. It was the same smile that once drew me in when I was grieving. The same smile that left me broken and empty. And in that instant, I realized this wasn't only Emily's engagement party. For me, it was the beginning of a war. After that night, I went home shaken to my core. I barely slept. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, asking myself if maybe grief and fear were making me see things that weren't there. But deep down, I knew it was him. The same man who had once walked into my life like a savior and left like a thief. 7 years earlier, when I was still raw from losing my husband, I let him in. He made me feel cared for, seen, wanted, until I realized he was slowly draining my late husband's life insurance. By the time I caught on, I had lost $75,000. Money meant for my future, gone in an instant, and he vanished before I could even process the betrayal. I told myself I would never be that naive again. But now, he was back. Only this time, he wasn't looking at me. He was holding my daughter's hand. Emily is 33, brilliant, kind, and far more successful than I ever dreamed I could be. What she doesn't know is that her father left her a trust fund that matures when she turns 35. 2 years from now, she'll have access to $27,000, a fortune compared to what he took from me. The wedding is set for just 4 weeks away. 4 weeks. That's all the time I have to figure out what he really wants and how far he's willing to go to get it. And as that realization settled into my chest, I knew I couldn't wait for answers to come to me. I had to start digging, even if it meant reopening old wounds. I kept replaying the past in my head, trying to convince myself I was wrong. But the memories of 2018 were too sharp to dismiss. I had been 58, only 6 months into widowhood. My husband's sudden heart attack left me drowning in loneliness. That's when a man named Kevin Rhodes, at least that was the name he used back then, appeared. He seemed attentive, thoughtful, patient. He knew exactly how to speak to someone who was vulnerable. For nearly a year, I believed him. I even believed the fantasy of building a future together. Until the day I realized he had been quietly siphoning away the very money my husband left me to survive. That betrayal reshaped me. I thought it had made me stronger. But seeing him again, this time as Daniel Ward, with a fresh suit, a fresh name, and my daughter's hand in his, shook me to the core. At Emily's engagement party, I tried to keep calm. I watched him mingle, remembering how he used to move through a room. He never just introduced himself. He made people feel like they were the center of the universe. He remembered names instantly, asked questions that sounded intimate, and leaned in just enough to feel trustworthy. He hadn't changed a thing. And the worst part? If I didn't know his past, I might have admired him too. That terrified me. If I could still be fooled by the surface, how could my daughter, young, hopeful, and deeply in love, ever see through it? That thought is what finally broke the silence inside me. I knew I had to test my instincts, and the only way to do that was to start digging into who Daniel Ward really was. 3 nights after the party, I found myself awake at 2 a.m, staring at the glow of my laptop screen. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as if the truth itself might burn me. I typed his new name, Daniel Ward, into every search engine I could think of. At first, it all looked normal: business listings, financial consulting websites, a LinkedIn profile that painted him as a polished professional. But then something felt off. Every record I pulled up had the same starting point: January of 2020. Nothing before. No digital footprint, no paper trail, no casual mentions in old articles. For a man his age, that was impossible. People leave marks. They leave addresses, jobs, traces of community, even high school reunion chatter. But Daniel Ward, it was as if he had been born 5 years ago. That was when I called Nora Sanchez, a private investigator a friend had once recommended. When she laid the documents out on my kitchen table, she didn't even try to sugarcoat it. She said a background that clean was not normal, it was manufactured. I studied the paperwork in front of me. Business licenses, tax filings, rental agreements, all beginning the same month, the same year. It was too neat, too precise, like a man who had wiped his past and written a brand new version of himself. And when Nora mentioned she had tracked similar patterns to Phoenix in 2020, Nashville in 2022, and Denver in 2023, my chest tightened. Those were not coincidences. That was a trail, and I already knew exactly where it led. By the time Sunday dinner came around, my nerves were stretched thin. Emily insisted I join them, as if this weekly ritual could smooth over the unease I carried. But sitting at that table across from Daniel felt like being trapped in a play where I already knew the ending. He had prepared some elaborate meal, the kind of performance that was meant to impress. And Emily looked at him with such open admiration, it made my chest ache. I tried to stay light, to keep my words neutral, but Daniel's eyes kept finding mine. It was as if we were locked in a silent game, each of us waiting for the other to make a move. I could sense him weaving subtle threads into Emily's thoughts, planting the idea that I was being difficult, maybe even jealous of her happiness. And the cruel part, it worked. In the weeks that followed, Emily grew distant. Phone calls became shorter, always rushed. Plans we once kept without question, our Saturday brunches, our evening walks, were suddenly forgotten. She was always busy, always preoccupied with something tied to Daniel. I felt the space between us widening, like he was gently pulling her to his side while nudging me out of her world. The breaking point came on a Monday morning around 9:15. Emily stood in my doorway, arms crossed, her voice steady but cold. She told me maybe it would be better if we gave each other space until after the wedding. The words landed like a physical blow. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My own daughter, my Emily, was asking me to step back from her life. That was when grief gave way to something stronger. Anger. A fire lit inside me. If Daniel thought he could erase me from my daughter's story, he had underestimated the wrong woman. I picked up the phone and called Nora. When Nora came over that week, she brought more than just a folder of papers. She brought the truth I had been dreading. She spread photographs and documents across my dining room table, the evidence forming a pattern that made my stomach turn. The women looked different different ages, careers, and cities, but the timeline was always the same. They were successful, usually in their early 30s, often fresh from heartbreak or loss. He appeared when they were most vulnerable. Within months, they were engaged. Within weeks of the wedding, he vanished, taking whatever he could. In Phoenix in 2020, it was a tech executive who had just sold her startup. In Nashville in 2022, it was a young widow who had inherited her husband's life insurance. In Denver in 2023, it was a woman who had just taken over her family's business. Each story ended in devastation, money drained, reputations ruined, futures derailed. And now, standing at the end of that pattern, was my daughter, Emily, who had just made partner at her law firm. Emily, who carried not only her father's generous heart, but also the promise of that $27,000 trust fund. Looking at those files, I realized this wasn't just history repeating itself. It was a blueprint. He wasn't improvising. He was executing a plan. I pressed my hands against the table, trying to steady my breath. If Emily couldn't see the danger, then it was up to me. But how could I protect her without losing her trust completely? That question haunted me, and it pushed me toward the next risky step. I decided to change my approach. If I kept pressing Emily, she would only retreat further into his arms. So I tried something dangerous. I pretended to surrender. I reached out to Daniel and suggested we meet for lunch. I framed it as an olive branch, a chance to get to know each other better, to ease the tension. We sat down around 12:40 at a quiet little restaurant tucked away from the city noise. I chose the spot carefully. It was intimate enough for him to feel comfortable, but open enough that I could breathe if things turned tense. I remember sitting there, folding my hands in my lap, forcing myself to smile, and waiting for him to show me who he really was. He leaned into a performance I knew all too well. He spoke gently, like a man who had reflected on his mistakes. He admitted to being reckless once, to hurting someone he cared about, but said it was the past. He painted himself as someone changed by time, someone wiser, steadier, grateful for a second chance. His words were coated in regret, almost tender, as if he was confessing a burden he had carried for years. And for a moment, just one moment, I almost let myself believe him. That was the frightening part. Even after all I knew, all I had lost, there was still a flicker of me that wanted to think people like him could change. But deep down, I recognized the act. It wasn't remorse, it was rehearsal. He was perfecting the mask. I left that lunch shaken, more aware than ever of how dangerous he really was. After that staged display of remorse, I went straight to Nora. I needed clarity. She listened carefully, her brow furrowed, then slid a new folder across the table. Inside was information I had not been prepared to see. She had gone deeper, tracing not just his new identity, but the lives he intersected with. Each woman followed the same trajectory: success, vulnerability, whirlwind romance, and then financial ruin. But some of those stories didn't just end with empty bank accounts, they ended with obituaries. That was when Nora introduced me to Agent Mark Chen. His sister had been one of Daniel's earlier victims, and he had been tracking him for years. Mark told me that too many of these women had died in so-called accidents within 18 months of meeting him. A car crash here, a fall down the stairs there, a drowning on vacation. On paper, they looked like tragedies. In reality, the pattern was too sharp to ignore. I remember sitting back in my chair, my skin prickling. My mind went to the bowl of soup Daniel had brought to my home just days earlier. He had insisted I eat it, even when I hesitated. The memory made my stomach twist. I realized then that his game was not just financial. He played for complete control, and sometimes control meant eliminating obstacles. The fear that settled into me that night was different. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about survival, Emily's and mine. That was when I knew we couldn't simply wait and watch. We had to force his hand. The FBI laid out the plan with calm precision. If we waited for Daniel to make his move, Emily might lose everything or worse. But if we confronted him too soon, without enough evidence, he would slip away again. The solution was to make him feel untouchable, to bait him into revealing himself. They asked me to be the one to step into the trap. I would go to his apartment at 7:30 in the evening, wearing a wire, and push him just enough so his ego would take over. I would let him think I had figured everything out, that I was about to tell Emily. They said a man like him couldn't stand the idea of being outsmarted. He would try to reassert control, and that's when the truth would surface. Walking up to that apartment building, my hands were shaking so badly I had to stop twice just to breathe. His place looked sterile, more like a hotel than a home. No photos, no warmth, just a stage he could leave at any moment. When I finally told him I knew who he really was, his face shifted. The charming smile slipped, replaced by a cold stillness. For a brief moment, I saw the predator beneath the mask. He moved casually to the kitchen, opening a drawer as if considering his next move. That night, I realized something terrifying. I thought I was stepping into a trap for him, but as I watched his eyes, I felt the truth. I might be the one who had walked straight into his. As I sat in that spotless apartment, heart pounding against the wire taped to my skin, I forced myself to stay steady. I told him I knew his pattern, how he rushed women into engagements, gained access to their accounts, then disappeared or left them broken. I said I wouldn't let him do that to my daughter. His expression hardened, and then, slowly, he smiled. It wasn't the charming smile Emily adored, or the careful performance he showed to strangers. It was something sharper, darker. He leaned back, relaxed, and told me it didn't matter what I knew. He said Emily had already signed the paperwork. He had convinced her to merge her assets into a joint account, framed as financial planning before marriage. By Monday morning at 9, $27,000 would be under his control. The words knocked the breath out of me. My mind raced, desperate to remember if Emily had mentioned anything about signing documents. I had dismissed her casual remarks about meetings with him and financial advisors. But now, they came flooding back. My throat went dry. What if it was true? What if he had already beaten me? He reveled in my silence, savoring it like a victory. He told me even if I tried to stop him, it was too late. That smile grew wider, almost triumphant. For a moment, I believed him. I believed I had failed my daughter again. And this time, the cost was everything she had built, everything her father had left her. And then the front door burst open. FBI agents rushed in, weapons drawn, commanding him to freeze. Daniel didn't flinch. He stood calmly, letting them cuff his wrists, but his eyes never left mine. You were too late, his stare seemed to say, but I would soon learn I wasn't the one who had been outplayed. As the agents secured Daniel, I felt both relief and dread. His parting words echoed in my head. Emily had already signed. My body sagged under the weight of that thought. Had I failed her again? And then, a familiar voice cut through the chaos. Emily stepped into the room, flanked by two more agents. Her face was pale, but steady. Her eyes locked on Daniel with a cold fury I had never seen in her before. In that instant, I understood. She had not been blind. She had not been as deceived as I feared. She had been watching him too. She had noticed the inconsistencies, the pressure, the manipulation, and instead of confronting me with anger, she had turned quietly to the FBI. The paperwork he bragged about. They were fakes, planted by the agents to feed his arrogance. The trust fund was untouched. My daughter had played a role in the very operation I thought I was leading. The swell of emotions nearly broke me relief. Pride, shame, and love all at once. For years, I had carried the weight of protecting her alone. Now I realized she had been standing beside me, stronger than I gave her credit for. She glanced at me, just a small nod, but it said everything. We had fought this battle together, even if we hadn't admitted it until now. 2 years later, the man we knew as Daniel Ward, real name Kevin Rhodes, was sentenced to life in prison. Fraud, identity theft, conspiracy, and finally, the deaths that had shadowed his path for over a decade. It was all laid bare in court. For once, he couldn't charm his way out of the truth. For Emily and me, the months that followed were not easy. Trust is fragile, even in the strongest families. She carried guilt for nearly being swept into his world, and I carried guilt for not trusting her strength sooner. But little by little, we rebuilt. Emily threw herself back into her work, but this time with healthier boundaries. She slowed down, allowed herself to heal, and eventually met someone new. Not in a whirlwind, not under pressure, just slowly, honestly. And when she finally decided to let someone into her heart again, she asked me to be there every step of the way. As for me, I learned a different kind of strength. For years, I believed my role was to shield her from harm, to carry every burden alone. But this ordeal showed me something else. Protection isn't always about building walls. Sometimes it's about standing beside the people we love, trusting that they can fight too. There are moments even now when I catch Emily's eye and we both remember what we went through. It's unspoken, but it binds us tighter than ever. We faced a predator who thought he could tear us apart. Instead, we walked away stronger, side by side. Looking back now, I realize this chapter of our lives was never just about stopping one man. It was about learning what it means to trust, to forgive ourselves, and to grow stronger as a family. I used to think protecting Emily meant standing in front of her, absorbing the blows before they reached her. But sometimes love means stepping aside just enough to let your child stand on her own, knowing you'll be there to catch them if they stumble. Emily showed me that. She wasn't the fragile girl I thought I needed to save. She was a woman, capable and resilient, and together we faced down a predator who believed he could outsmart us both. I won't pretend the scars aren't there. Betrayal leaves marks, but those marks remind us of what we survived. They remind us that family, at its strongest, isn't about shielding one another from every storm. It's about holding each other's hands through the storm and walking out the other side by side. So, if you're listening to this and you've ever felt torn between protecting someone you love and trusting them to handle the truth, I hope our story reminds you it doesn't have to be one or the other. Sometimes the strongest families fight together. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like, share, and leave a comment. Your thoughts matter more than you know. And who knows, your story might be the one someone else needs to hear next.